Let's start with Bloodborne. It absolutely deserved to win Game of the Year in 2015, but didn't quite get the crown. I mean, this game was From Software at its peak, delivering an intense gothic nightmare of a world that fans still rave about to this day. It's wild to think that something this groundbreaking didn't take home the big award. First off, the atmosphere in Bloodborne? Unreal. Yharnam was this dark, twisted, Victorian city filled with werewolves, cosmic horrors, and nightmare creatures that just kept you on edge the entire time. The design of the world was so hauntingly beautiful, with that classic From Software touch, where every alley and hidden path had a story to tell. The game didn't hold your hand either, which was part of its charm. You had to figure everything out on your own, from the lore to the mechanics. And let's talk about that combat system. Bloodborne took the typical slow, methodical Souls formula and made it fast and aggressive. You couldn't just hang back and wait. The game literally rewarded you for going on the offense with that regain system. If you got hit, you had a window to hit back and regain your health, which encouraged players to stay in the fight instead of running away. It was like Dark Souls on adrenaline. But here's the thing, Bloodborne came out the same year as The Witcher 3, Wild Hunt, and that's where things get tricky. The Witcher 3 swept most of the awards that year, and while it was undoubtedly a great game, a lot of people felt like Bloodborne was overshadowed because of that. But for those who played it, Bloodborne was a masterpiece. Next we have Red Dead Redemption 2, a game that absolutely dominated conversations when it came out, but somehow didn't win Game of the Year. And I get it, God of War was a beast in 2018. But let's be honest, Red Dead Redemption 2 was something else. This was a game that didn't just tell a story, it lived and breathed one. The world Rockstar created in Red Dead Redemption 2 was so immersive, it felt like the Old West was right there in front of you. And the detail? Insane. You could spend hours just wandering around, hunting, fishing, getting into random encounters. And every part of it felt like it was happening in real time. Rockstar nailed the atmosphere, from the dynamic weather to how towns felt alive. Even your horse had personality. People get so attached to their horses like it's a real companion. Now, the story is where the game really shines. Arthur Morgan? Easily one of the most complex, well-written characters in gaming. His whole journey of redemption, loyalty, and questioning his place in the gang gave players an emotional roller coaster. The game nailed that perfect blend of realism and fun. The way the world reacts to your choices, whether you're being honorable or wreaking havoc, makes every playthrough feel personal and unique. In the end, Red Dead Redemption 2 deserved all the praise and then some. It was more than just a game. It was an experience. The fact that it didn't win Game of the Year is still something people talk about, because it left such a lasting impact. Next we have Doom 4. This game brought back the old school shooter in the best way possible, but still didn't take home the Game of the Year award. And I'm still scratching my head over that, because Doom was an absolute beast when it dropped. It was like ID Software said, let's show everyone how a real first-person shooter is done. First of all, Doom nailed the pacing. It was fast, chaotic, and brutal. Everything you want in a Doom game. They took that classic run-and-gun formula and cranked it up to 11. You're constantly moving, jumping, and tearing through demons like a one-man wrecking crew. The combat was a symphony of destruction, where stopping meant death. And let's not forget the glory kills, where you get rewarded for ripping apart demons up close in the most satisfying ways possible. The thing that made Doom stand out was how unapologetically old school it was. No cover mechanics, no reloading, just pure adrenaline-fueled action. It felt like a return to form for the genre. And in a sea of shooters that were leaning more toward tactical, slow-paced gameplay, Doom was like a wake-up call. It reminded everyone why the original Doom was such a phenomenon back in the day. Why it didn't win Game of the Year. One reason could be that it released in a pretty stacked year. 2016 had Overwatch taking a lot of the spotlight, and multiplayer shooters were all the rage. Doom, on the other hand, was a more solo-focused experience. Sure, it had a multiplayer mode, but that's not what people played it for. It was all about that single-player campaign. Next we have The Evil Within, a game that brought some real old-school survival horror vibes, but didn't quite get the love it deserved. Honestly, this game flew under the radar for a lot of people, which is crazy because it was directed by Shinji Mikami, the guy behind Resident Evil 4. You'd think that would have guaranteed a Game of the Year contender, right? What made The Evil Within stand out was how it balanced psychological horror with intense, sometimes brutal action. The game wasn't just about jump scares, though it had plenty of those. It was about atmosphere, tension, and always keeping the player on edge. You never felt safe, which is what survival horror should be all about. And the world? Creepy, unsettling, filled with twisted, nightmarish creatures. It really felt like a descent into madness. But let's be real. The evil within wasn't for everyone, and that's probably why it didn't snag a Game of the Year. The difficulty was punishing at times, with limited ammo, tough enemies, and the kind of survival mechanics that could frustrate players who weren't prepared for that hardcore experience. It had this real old-school design that some players loved, but others found off-putting. People who were used to more action-focused horror games weren't always vibing with the slower, more methodical pace. The game was also pretty divisive when it came to its story. Some people thought the plot was all over the place, a little too cryptic and hard to follow, but here's the thing. If you were a fan of old-school survival horror, The Evil Within was a gem. It was a love letter to the genre, and it had all the elements to be a classic. Next we have Final Fantasy VII Remake. This game took one of the most iconic RPGs of all time and flipped it in the best way possible. It was a love letter to fans of the original, while also introducing a whole new generation to the world of Final Fantasy VII. Honestly, it not winning Game of the Year still feels like a bit of a robbery. First off, the remake was more than just a visual upgrade. Yes, the graphics were jaw-dropping. Midgar looked absolutely incredible, from the towering structures of Shinra to the gritty streets of the slums. But it was the way they expanded the story that really stood out. Characters like Biggs, Wedge, and Jesse, who were barely more than side characters in the original, suddenly had fleshed-out backstories and personalities. It made you care about them in a way you just couldn't before, which made certain story moments hit even harder. The combat was another huge change. Gone were the strict turn-based mechanics, replaced with this hybrid system that mixed action and strategy. You could hack and slash through enemies in real time, but still slow things down to issue commands, use spells, or unleash limit breaks. It was the perfect blend of old and new, catering to both fans of traditional JRPGs and those who preferred more modern action RPG mechanics. Another reason it might have missed out on Game of the Year is that 2020 was a crazy year for games. The Last of Us Part 2 took home the big prize, and while that game had its own controversies, it was a narrative and technical powerhouse that dominated most of the awards that year. Next we have Resident Evil Village, another game that could have easily taken the Game of the Year title, but somehow didn't. And honestly, that's kind of surprising because when Village dropped, it felt like Capcom had found the perfect balance between horror, action, and just downright weirdness. One of the standout things about Resident Evil Village was how it mixed elements from both Resident Evil 7 and the more action-heavy style of Resident Evil 4. You had the creepy, atmospheric horror from 7, but then they threw in these larger-than-life characters and set pieces that screamed RE4, Lady Dimitrescu. Instantly iconic. She had the internet buzzing for months before the game even came out, and her castle felt like this throwback to the gothic vibes of older Resident Evil games. But what made Village special was how it didn't stick to just one type of horror. Each section of the game felt different. You had survival horror with limited resources in some areas, and then you'd go into full-on action mode with tons of firepower in others. And let's not forget the Beneviento house. That whole part was straight-up nightmare fuel. It felt like Capcom was experimenting with different horror subgenres, and for the most part, it totally worked. There was also the story. Resident Evil games have always been known for their over-the-top plots, and Village didn't disappoint in that regard. 2021 was a tough year for competition. It Takes Two ended up winning Game of the Year, and while it's a great game, it's a totally different vibe. Next we have Assassin's Creed Origins. It didn't win Game of the Year, but absolutely deserved to be in the conversation. After the series took a bit of a break, Origins came back swinging, and it basically reinvented the entire franchise. This was the game that moved Assassin's Creed from a more linear, mission-based structure to a full-blown open-world RPG, and it did it in style. First off, ancient Egypt as a setting? Incredible. The world they built in Origins was stunning, from the sprawling deserts to the bustling cities of Alexandria and Memphis. You could just wander around for hours, exploring tombs, pyramids, and hidden secrets. The amount of detail they put into recreating Egypt was mind-blowing, and it felt like you were actually stepping into history. Plus, playing as the first assassin was a breath of fresh air. He was such a well-rounded character with a personal story that drove the whole plot forward in a meaningful way. The combat system was also completely overhauled. Gone were the days of just counter-killing everything in sight. Origins introduced a more dynamic, skill-based combat system that required you to dodge, block, and actually strategize during fights. It felt much more engaging and challenging compared to the older games. They also introduced RPG elements like leveling up, skill trees, and loot, which added a ton of depth to the gameplay. But here's the thing. 2017 was a ridiculously stacked year for gaming. The Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild, and Horizon Zero Dawn both came out that year. Next we have Dead Space Remake, a game that completely revitalized a classic survival horror experience and honestly deserved a shot at Game of the Year. The original Dead Space was already a masterpiece, but the remake took it to another level, with modern graphics, tighter gameplay, and some amazing quality of life improvements. It was like stepping back into a nightmare, but with 4K visuals and even more horrifying details. First off, the atmosphere in the Dead Space remake was next level. The USG Ishimura felt more alive and dead than ever. Every creak, every shadow, and every flickering light just added to that sense of dread. The developers did an incredible job preserving what made the original so terrifying, while also cranking up the immersion. They rebuilt the whole game from the ground up, and it showed in how polished the environments were. The lighting alone made certain sections feel way scarier than before, like you're always one step away from something terrible. But here's the thing. While the Dead Space remake was stunning and faithful to its source material, some people argued that it didn't do enough to push the genre forward, which is probably why it didn't take home the Game of the Year trophy. It was a fantastic remake, but it stayed close to the original's formula, which, for some, felt more like a tribute than a bold new experience. But here's the bottom line. The Dead Space remake did exactly what it set out to do, remind us why this franchise is one of the best in survival horror. The fact that it didn't win Game of the Year doesn't take away from the fact that it was one of the most polished and terrifying games of 2023. Next we have The Outer Worlds. While it didn't win Game of the Year in 2019, it absolutely deserved to be in the conversation. This was Obsidian showing everyone they still had that RPG magic, delivering a game with tight writing, a quirky sense of humor, and a whole galaxy's worth of exploration and moral dilemmas. It was a breath of fresh air in a genre dominated by massive open-world RPGs, proving that sometimes less is more when it's done right. The world building was top-notch. Set in a retro-futuristic galaxy ruled by megacorporations, the game gave you a ton of freedom to explore different planets, each with its own distinct vibe and politics. The whole corporation's run everything setting was dripping with satire, and it really hit home, especially with the dialogue options. You could choose to be a hero, a corporate shill, or just a chaotic wildcard, and the game would react accordingly. Every decision felt meaningful, and there were so many different ways to play through the story. The writing was easily one of the game's strongest points. Whether it was the witty banter with your companions, or the moral dilemmas you faced with every mission, the dialogue was smart and sharp. The characters, like Parvati, who became an instant fan favorite, were charming and well-written. They added a lot of heart to the otherwise cynical tone of the game, and their personal side quests gave the game an emotional core. One controversy was that, despite its great writing and humor, the game's combat wasn't exactly its strongest feature. It was solid, but not particularly deep. Next we have A Plague Tale Requiem. It absolutely should have been in the running for Game of the Year, but didn't quite get the recognition it deserved. This sequel took everything great about A Plague Tale Innocence and cranked it up to a whole new level. The story, the characters, the visuals, it was all so much more intense. And honestly, it hit harder than a lot of people expected. First off, the story in Requiem was a gut punch in the best way. Following Amisha and Hugo's journey through a world ravaged by the plague and the supernatural rat infestation, you could feel the stakes growing as you progressed. What really stood out was the emotional weight of the game. It wasn't just about survival. It was about family, loss, and the lengths you'd go to protect the ones you love. The character development for both Amicia and Hugo was top tier, and by the end, it was impossible not to be emotionally invested in their fate. The game also looked absolutely stunning. The environments were jaw-dropping, whether you were sneaking through crumbling ruins, lush countrysides, or the plague-infested streets. The attention to detail made the world feel alive. Well, as alive as a world overrun by millions of rats can feel. And speaking of the rats, Requiem took the swarming rat mechanic from the first game and made it even crazier. The way they used light and shadow to control and avoid the rats created some of the most tense, nail-biting moments in the game. Another thing to consider is that Requiem came out in 2022, which was a year dominated by games like Elden Ring and God of War Ragnarok.